It's been a very, very full and informative day, but I'm really happy that we're going to cap it off with these two speakers. So I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Jackie Ricotta, a faculty member at Delaware Valley University in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, and I am the academic program director of the Organic Farming Certificate Program in partnership with the Rodale Institute. I'm also a board member of NOFA-New Jersey, and when they asked the volunteers for the conference if they wanted to introduce speakers, when I saw that Liz and Bob were going to be here, I immediately said I wanted to introduce them because I read Liz's book a few years ago after it came out. In fact, as I was telling her, I actually asked our Del Valle library to order it because I'd read a review and I'm like, oh, I really want to read this. And as well as being an excellent read, I learned about beluga lentils, which I didn't know about. So anyway, if you haven't read it, I can highly recommend it. And then I also heard Bob speak this past summer at Rodale, and it was really awesome. So I was very, very happy to be here this afternoon to introduce them and to be able to hear both of them speak. So Liz Carlisle, Dr. Liz Carlisle is at the University of California at Santa Barbara, where she's an assistant professor in the Environmental Studies program. Her work focuses on a more just and sustainable food system. She holds a doctorate in geography from UC Berkeley and a Bachelor of Arts degree in folklore and mythology from Harvard. And she formerly served as a legislative correspondent for Ag and Natural Resources in the office of U.S. Senator John Tester. Liz has been recognized for academic publishing with Elsevier Atlas Award, which honors research with social impact. And she's also written numerous pieces for general audience readers in the New York Times, the LA Times, Business Insider, and Stanford Social Innovation Review. She's not only the author of Lentil Underground, which won the 2016 Montana Book Award, but she's the co-author with Bob Quinn of Grain by Grain, both of books of which have been for sale in the room upstairs. And here's Grain by Grain. And then I'll introduce Bob Quinn. He was raised on a 2,400 acre wheat and cattle ranch in Montana. Bob went on to earn a doctorate in plant biochemistry at UC Davis before he decided to come home and farm in 1978. In 1986, he planted his first organic crop, and by 1989, he'd converted his entire farm. So quite a while ago. That's awesome. He served on the first National Organic Standards Board, which spurred on the creation of the National Organic Program, and he's been recognized by the Montana Organic Association with their Lifetime Service Award. He's also been honored by the Organic Trade Association with their Organic Leadership Award, and he's received the Organic Pioneers Award from the Rodale Institute. As an entrepreneur, Bob has founded 5 significant enterprises: a regional mill for organic and heritage grains, an organic snack company, which I was able to taste those at Rodale, they were good, a business that sells culinary oil and recycles it as a biofuel, Montana's first wind farm, and Camu International, which is wow. Do you sleep? No. Anyway, additionally, Bob remains active in research and has co-authored pioneering studies on the nutritional benefits of ancient grains. So we clearly have 2 amazing people here to speak with us this afternoon. I'm so grateful that you made the trip out here to be at NOFA, New Jersey, and just thank you so much. So I believe we have Liz up first.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and thanks so much to NOFA New Jersey for inviting us to be here. I've learned so many really fascinating and inspiring things today about the work that folks are doing here in New Jersey, and really sort of across all of the pieces of this food systems puzzle, from land access to seed democracy to building more local food systems, and it's just really been an inspiration and super informative to be here today. So thank you so much for the invitation. And I'm really excited for you to get to have a little bit of the experience that I've gotten to have over the past couple years of sitting with Bob Quinn and picking his brain a little bit as somebody who's been an organic farmer now for over 30 years. And really seeing this journey of our movement as it grows, and with some really wise reflections on where we're headed. So I'm excited to spend most of this time today for you to hear from Bob's experience, because he has an incredible story to tell, and also I think a lot that could be of use as you guys can kind of swap stories about efforts you're engaged in. But just to kind of put in context, I think, how revolutionary it is to be doing regenerative organic grain and building regional economies, I want to start by just telling a little bit of the story of wheat production in the US, because this isn't actually even just about grain. I think it's about how we relate to our food system in general and how we've built to the point we are now. And so if we're working in grain and we're working to build regenerative organic grain systems that are situated in a regional economy, I want to tell this story because I think it helps give some perspective on why that's not only important for the grain itself, but I think it's just exactly the terrain on which we can start kind of unwinding some of the ways in which our economy has stopped serving local living economies. So bear with me here for a minute. We're headed back to the 1840s. So in the 1840s, wheat farming was very different than it is today. Farmers still worked principally with horse-drawn plows, and much of what they grew was eaten on the farm or sold locally. Wheat varieties differed remarkably from farm to farm, each with its own unique flavor. The American countryside boasted a whopping 23,000 flour mills, where people could bring their own wheat or their neighbor's wheat to be turned into flour. The surplus wheat of the mid-19th century was parceled into individual sacks and loaded onto a flatboat, likely headed for the wheat capital of the day, St. Louis. Each sack was traceable back to the farmer who grew it, who retained ownership of the grain through its final sale. Buyers would test a small sample and offer a price based on how plump, clean, and flavorful they found the wheat from a particular sack. In 1848, Chicago's newly built railroad depot welcomed its first locomotive, the Pioneer, heralding an era of massive Western railroad construction. 19th century railroad magnates had their eye on multiple profit-making ventures, from tourism to Western settlement to accumulating enormous tracts of land. But high on their list was wheat, which presented an opportunity to grow their profits long into the future. By 1855, railroads had trumped flatboats, and Chicago had surpassed St. Louis as the grain capital of the American West. Individual sacks of wheat owned by individual farmers were cumbersome for railroads to handle. Getting them on and off cars took considerable time, which for the railroad operators was money. A solution arrived in the form of the steam-powered grain elevator, first introduced by a Buffalo warehouse owner named Joseph Dart in 1842 and perfected in Chicago over the course of the next 2 decades. Wheat entered this elevator on a conveyor belt, shuffled into buckets to be weighed, and then, with the pull of a lever, could be sorted into one of several bins. To deliver grain to a customer, workers simply had to open a chute and let gravity carry the wheat from the bin to a waiting ship or railroad car. Steam-powered elevators greatly increased the efficiency of wheat dealing, but there was still a catch. Although steam elevator operators did away with individual sacks, they nonetheless had to keep each farm's grain in a separate bin, since each load was still owned by its farmer and would be priced based on its quality. So bins ended up sitting half empty, denying elevator operators the full revenue potential of their facilities. So in 1856, the Chicago Board of Trade devised a solution, proposing standard grades for wheat. The Board of Trade was a Chamber of Commerce-like institution, still just 8 years old at the time. And at first, it had struggled to attract interest from the Chicago business community. Membership rolls from 1851 reveal several days when no one showed up. But things picked up at the Board of Trade in the mid-1850s as the grain export business to Europe gained traction, and one of the first items on the agenda was a grading system for wheat. The Board of Trade system divided wheat into 3 standard categories: white winter wheat, red winter wheat, and spring wheat. Over the next several years, the board subdivided these categories into numbered grades, indicating quality. So the diversity of wheat grown on the American prairie was reduced to 12 standard commodities. Under the new Board of Trade system, farmers who hauled their wheat to a warehouse were given a receipt indicating the volume and grade of wheat delivered. This receipt could then be sold to a buyer who gained the rights to the grain. Not the rights to the same wheat the farmer delivered, but to an equal volume of the same grade of wheat. So once the ownership rights to wheat were severed from the physical wheat itself, it didn't take long for people to figure out that the elevator receipts could be bought and sold without actually having to move grain around. Some unscrupulous elevator operators went so far as to print and sell receipts for grain that didn't actually exist. But while illegal activity aroused the ire of farmers, it was actually legal maneuvers that would more fundamentally transform their livelihoods. With the arrival of telegraph lines in Chicago in the mid-1800s, people could now purchase elevator receipts remotely, not based on physical observation of the wheat's quality, but just on the grade. Grain prices on the western frontier, which had previously been linked to local markets, soils, and climate, began to reflect grain prices on the eastern seaboard and in Europe. Boosters for the Board of Trade system argued that joining up with larger markets would stabilize prices for farmers. But with much of the world's grain being traded in a single marketplace, disasters that were once local or regional became global crises. Sometime in the 1850s, grain buyers started to purchase wheat on to-arrive contracts. Railroads, though faster than flatboats, were slower than telegraph lines, and nobody wanted to wait for the carloads to arrive in the depot to complete the sale. So sellers promised the grain would arrive at a future date. Gradually, such dates got pushed further and further into the future until it became apparent that buyers and sellers were gambling on the future price of wheat. And concerned about the potential for fraud, the Chicago Board of Trade standardized these contracts for grain futures in 1865, which made them even more interchangeable. Buyers and sellers stopped settling up in grain and just paid each other the difference between the contract price and the price of wheat when the contract came due. Now that wheat was traded on paper, buyers no longer saw the actual grain. They certainly didn't see the farm. All they saw were 2 numbers, volume and grade, which offered farmers little opportunity to differentiate the taste or nutritional quality of their crop. With wheat's complex journey from seed to table collapsed into such an abbreviated representation of its worth, a long march of value subtraction ensued, beginning at the origin of the whole process on the land. So in many ways, wheat was sort of the ground on which we started thinking of our food system, thinking of our food as a commodity, and developing the institutions through which we would economically relate to our food as a commodity. So for this reason, I think this work in rebuilding a grain shed that I know folks were speaking about this morning is so powerful, because if we can figure out how to rebuild a local living economy around grain, perhaps we can do the same thing, not just for vegetables and livestock, but even things beyond our food system, because grain, I think, is really where we started to go down this road of a financialized commodity rather than recognizing that this is a tie to land, this is a tie to health. So just to put in some context, I think that when we talk about rebuilding our grain sheds, we're also talking about rebuilding living relationships to land and each other. So with that sort of introduction to the story of wheat, it's really my pleasure to welcome to the stage Bob Quinn.
Thanks, Liz. It's great to be here. It's a big honor to be invited to be a part of NOFA meeting and meet so many more new friends and reacquaint myself with some ones I've had in the past. And my mother actually graduated from Summit High School, so we have some connections with New Jersey, although she married my dad right after World War II, moved to Montana, and hardly ever looked back, although she left the comforts of city life for a homestead with no electricity and hardly any running water. Although she convinced my dad to add both of those in the very near future. See, so anyway, that was her introduction. I am going to not exactly pick up where Liz left off because there's about 100 years from the beginning of the commoditization of wheat till the point I came along, but it was well established. And I'm going to share with you some of my journey on unraveling that and starting to come back the other way. So, first of all, though, let me ask here, how many of you folks are farmers or ranchers or want to be or have been or hope to be? Almost every, how many are not? Maybe I should ask that. 2 or 3, okay, 4 or 5 or 6, okay. Here's why I asked that question, and the ratio is often switched around the other way, but it works just as well as what we've seen today. As Wendell Berry explained, eating is an agricultural act, and a good friend of mine, Carlo Petrini, who started the slow food movement in Italy, says it this way: eaters are co-producers of food. So it doesn't really matter what side of the fence we're on, if we're farmers or ranchers or eaters. We're really co-producers, each of us, because every time you go to the store, and for those of you who don't have a farm, and don't get something out of your garden, but get something off the shelf in the store, every time you go to the restaurant and order something, every time you fix a meal, you're actually determining somewhere what some farmer is planting or going to plant. Therefore, you become a co-producer. How many here eat what they grow off their farm? Half or so, more? Good. In Montana, I don't know hardly anybody that eats the wheat off their farm. Of course, there's a little bit of a processing involved, but still, it's something that the more we can eat of what we grow, I think it really connects us even more to our farms and our soil. So this is my first tractor. I show that because to contrast with my last combine. And so things kind of changed even in my lifetime. I say it's my last combine because a couple years ago I rented out my farm to folks that had worked for me and I had trained up in how to be organic farmers for in one case 6, in one case 3 years. And I figured after 40 years of farming, it was time for the next generation to have their turn. And since none of my kids had showed up at the doorstep yet, I wasn't going to sit there until I died and then not give someone else a chance. So the next generation has taken over. And this is a couple years previous to that. Our farm was started from my grandfather in 1920. So this year, in June, we'll celebrate our 100th anniversary. We're pretty excited about that. We're going to have a big family reunion. And when I was growing up, wheat really was considered by us as the staff of life, and it was our main product. We grew winter wheat, spring wheat, and barley, and a little bit of oats for the cows, and that was it. That was our main crops. But now, these days, 20% of the people in America can no longer eat wheat without some kind of a difficulty, some kind of sensitivity. 1% are celiac. That's a very serious disease. That's a complete gluten intolerance. But 20% are less than the gluten intolerance. They have something else wrong. And all kinds of maladies show up, from indigestion to bloating to rashes or all kinds of stuff, respiratory stuff. And I, as a wheat farmer, I took this quite personal. You see, this was kind of a slap in the face to someone who's trying to grow something. If 20% of your potential customers don't even look at you anymore with any kind of appreciation or even want to buy your products, And I wondered why. What had happened? What had happened over the recent history that had changed the staff of life, the grain that had built the great civilizations of the ancient world, the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Babylonians, the ancient Romans and Greeks, and even parts of China were all built on wheat. And yet now we have this kind of a situation. So after a lot of study, what I had really come to the understanding is that it's not just one thing. It's not just gluten, but it's based on three different areas, really. It's a three-legged stool. One of production, one leg of processing, and one leg of seeds. But before I get into all that, let me give you a little background of where I came from and how I got to this kind of understanding. So when I was growing up, my big loves were science and plants. And I really thought that was the most interesting thing in the world for me to study. So when I went to school, I combined those two and studied botany and plant pathology at Montana State University for 5 years. I got a master's and a bachelor's there. And then I went on to UC Davis and went 5 more years and got a PhD in plant biochemistry. And I thought I was going to be a great plant researcher. That's what I wanted to do. By the time I went to school for 10 years, my folks thought, my gosh, isn't that enough? And I thought, well, yeah, it is enough. But I was a little discouraged and disillusioned with some of what was going on in academia at the time. Instead of pushing back the frontiers of science and knowledge, many times we were told, well, don't say anything about what we're doing in our lab with so-and-so, especially in the next campus and whatnot, because they're in competition with us for the same money. And so it turned to be, I was really surprised it was more about getting grants and money than it was about working together to have more of an understanding. That wasn't the whole story, but I was surprised to see that. And that was a little disillusioning to me, who was so full of optimism and spirit for learning and science. So I decided, after trying a business adventure in California that lasted a couple of years, I decided I didn't want to raise my family there, and we packed up and we moved back to the farm. And I came back to the farm in Montana with no plans at all to change anything. I thought things were going pretty well the way they were. Really, the way I had been raised was with new chemicals and new varieties and increasing yields, and everything seemed pretty fine on the surface. And yet when we got home, back to our farm, it's 2,400 acres as was mentioned, and that was a perfect size, or a nice size to support one family, but really a little small to support two. And so I started poking around for ideas of what we could do to bring more income to the farm. I didn't want to go to town and get a job. That's not why I'd come back to the farm. And my wife had 3 little kids, so she wasn't ready to go to town and get a job. She had more than a full-time job. Besides, she was great help to me in the field too, and on the farm. So I hated to lose that help. So I had the opportunity to meet up with a cousin of mine in Southern California about 1983. This is about 5 years after we moved back to the farm. And he said, why don't we sell your wheat directly to whole grain bakers in Southern California? In a very short time, we found a great customer called Jim Torres. He had a company called Food for Life. And they started taking a truckload a week of our grain, of semi-loads. So that was about 750 bushel or so. And he was paying $1 over the market price. He was paying us $4 instead of $3. This increased our return by 1/3. This is huge. And so I thought, wow, this is fantastic. We have really bumped into some way where we can start to support 2 families on the size of the farm that supported 1, and just by increasing the value of what we sold. And after about a year, everything was going just really smooth. He called up and says, hey, Bob, he says, you suppose you could find me some organic grain about the same kind of quality that you're selling me now? And of course, you know, when a customer asks you for something, what do you say?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Jim, no, don't worry about a thing. Yeah, we'll have it down there in 10 days or maybe 2 weeks. Yep, we can do that, sure, don't worry, yep, thank you, bye. I hung up the phone and I thought, I don't even know any organic farmers. I said, where am I going to find organic wheat? In fact, I didn't even believe in organic agriculture and organic farming. I mean, I had been raised to understand that it was better living through chemistry. And When I was in California, I'd heard about some of the organic movement, just getting started. I already thought it was a bunch of hooey. I believed, as I had been taught, that a plant couldn't tell the difference between a molecule of nitrogen coming out of a manure pile and one coming out of a bag of ammonium sulfate. That's what I'd been taught. And so we didn't know anything about feeding. We didn't talk about feeding the soil like that. We were feeding the plant. And what the plant needed, that's what we were going to deliver. And when you deliver what the plant needed, it grew and it produced. So that was my mentality. But I wasn't going to let my prejudice stand in the way of finding something that my customer wanted, right? So I started making some phone calls, and I found a fellow clear up in the northeast part of Montana, about 300 miles from me. I was in the north central part. And so I went up there and he signed a little affidavit saying it complied with the California law, and I loaded up his grain and took it back and cleaned it, bagged it, and shipped to California. And Jim said, "Oh, this is great. Can you find me another load?" I thought, oh my gosh. So I started calling around. I finally found 4 or 5 farmers in the whole state that had organic wheat. And I started talking to these guys, and they invited me to one of their little meetings. And I had been a member of Farm Bureau and grain growers, and when I go to their meetings, the discussion was, oh, woe is me, the price is down the toilet, and what are we going to do to get more money out of the government programs, and on and on. And it was really more about, well, sometimes I'd say farming the government than farming our farm. But that was the mentality, and that was sort of the discussion. When I went to this organic meeting, it was all about farming the farm and how the farm was responding, how it was changing, how they could walk across their fields and feel the difference in the tilth under their feet. It's something they could feel. How they could raise their own fertilizer. How by doing rotations, they broke up cycles of disease and pests and weeds and all these things, so they didn't need to use herbicides and chemicals. And I thought, wow, this is really very interesting. And I went home and I said, Dad, we got to try a little organic experiment. He said, oh man, that won't work here. And I said, well, let's just try 20 acres. So that was 1% of our cropland at that time, or even less. And we had 20 acres in alfalfa. We worked that down and we planted winter wheat. Next to it, we had 20 acres of regular winter wheat, which we fertilized up to the same level of nitrogen I found in the soil test from the alfalfa plowed down. And we were off. And to make a long story short, at harvest time, there was almost no difference in the yield. One was 35 bushel, and the other was 37 or so, just a couple bushel. That was a fair crop for us in those days. The protein, which is the other thing that we're concerned about, and we get paid for, sometimes the premium if it's good, was also about the same. The organic in this case was about 2/10 higher, it was about 15.7, and compared to about 15.5 for the chemical side. And I was thrilled. My experiment had worked, and I was off and running, and my dad was astonished. Here he had been spending tens of thousands of dollars every year for the best that science had to offer in the form of chemistry, fertilizers and herbicides. We didn't usually spray with pesticides, very rarely. And yet, here this whippersnapper of a son had come back from California and produced almost the same yield, almost the same protein as he had, only spending none of that kind of money, just for working down an alfalfa patch that had been in probably 3 or 4 years is all. So he was surprised. And I said, Dad, wow, look at this. I said, let's go 50% next year. He said, whoa. He says, how about 15? I said, how about 25? He said, okay, 20. We'll settle on 20. So anyway, we increased our experiment the next year. Now, next year was 1988, and it was a drought year. And in Montana, when we have drought, we usually have grasshoppers. And that's what happened to us at that time. The grasshoppers just came in by hordes, and they were mowing down everything that were coming out of the pastures into our grain fields. And so with the chemical field, it's pretty simple. You just call up your local spray guy. You say, hey, Joe, I got grasshoppers. Can you take care of that? Yeah, Bob, don't worry about it. We'll be by no more. Here comes the plane, malafine all over everything. And just like that, grasshoppers are all dead. Of course, everything else is dead too. In any conversation, we kind of go like, hey, and Bob, now remember, don't go in the field for 24 hours after I spray because, after all, malafine is a poison, I say, yeah, I know. So anyway, that's how it was. Meanwhile, across the creek, in my organic field, the grasshoppers were starting to get closer too, but as the grass was drying down in the pastures, I knew my winter was going to be next. And so I called up my organic friends, what do we do with grasshoppers? And he said, don't be calm, don't worry. He said, all you have to do is go and buy some of this NOFA-NJ. It was a brand name for a protozoa that had been put onto wheat bran. And protozoas are a little bit smaller than a bacteria. And grasshoppers eat those and they get sick and they die. And while they're sitting there jerking and, in their last pains of death, their friends come and eat them. It's kind of like modern day. So the disease is spread from the sick grasshoppers to all the healthy ones. And even though they ate into that field probably 15 or 20 feet, by the time I combined the field, there were almost no grasshoppers in the grain tank. And it wasn't a great crop, it was a drought year after all, but across the creek again when I combined my chemical field, after the malathion had worn off in 10 days or 2 weeks, the next flush of grasshoppers came in. And now I couldn't put good money after bad because it's very expensive to do insecticides. We normally don't do that. And I just let it go. And by the time harvest came, I had more grasshoppers in the grain tank than grain. It was a big, big difference. And I said to my dad, I said, okay, this is the second year now of our experiment. And we have done everything that chemistry has to offer and have done it just as the label said, and it was a complete disaster, a failure. And the organic system was working. I said, I want to go 100% organic from now on. And he supported me with that, which I really appreciated. So in 1988 was the last chemical we ever used on our whole farm from then till now. And it's been a great trip of learning and experimentation. It hasn't always been a bed of roses, but I always said to my friends, they said, oh man, that's pretty dramatic. And I said, you'll never learn to walk if you keep using the crutches. And so I just threw away all the crutches and I just went cold turkey. I wouldn't recommend for people to do that with their whole farm normally, but anyway, I was anxious to get started and to get learning. So this is what I've learned. After our first experiment, we found that we could lower the input costs by almost 2/3 or 3/4. We increased the value of our crops by 50% to 100%, sometimes 200%. We increased the agronomic and economic viability of our farm. We used to have a production loan that we would have to take every year out from the bank so that we could buy our seed and our chemicals and all this stuff. And then we paid that back at the end of the season. That loan was starting to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And it was to the point that the bank was concerned about cutting into the equity value of our farm. Within 3 years, we were able to pay off that operating note, and we never have had one since. And that's been a real testimony to me of the economic viability of it. And it made it was more fun. Every year was like a new chess game. And the weather would be different, and everything would be a little bit different, and you'd have to figure out how to work with nature to make a successful result. And that was fun for me. That was really a lot of fun. Made me really learn about the soil, learn about the life in the soil, about rotations, about plants, things I never really had learned or studied before. So after 30 years of research, this is what I have learned, just to boil it down to a couple principles of regenerative organic systems. And I like to put together regenerative organic. There's a lot of people throwing around regenerative now. There's no definition. People generally know what they're talking about, but a lot of times the no-tillers in the West where I live are using glyphosate as part of the regenerative system. And to me, to use a poison really isn't totally regenerative. And yet I also have a few organic friends who are not very focused on soil building, and they bring in all their inputs, and they're really focused on feeding the plants. And I think if you look at the two, that regenerative without organic is just as deficient as organic without regenerative. They really need to be linked together to get the full value of both concepts. So the first principle that I learned was diversity. So if you look around, do you see any monoculture in nature? In the forest, in the lakes, in the streams, anywhere you look, in the desert even, there's no monoculture there. It's complete diversity. And there's also no fertilizer trucks, right? There's no chemical sprayers. How does it work? I mean, how does it work after all these eons? You know, you talk about one thing that really gravels me sometimes is when people talk about conventional agriculture as it's, you know, the greatest and latest and all that stuff. Conventional agriculture is what we've been doing for the last 10,000 years. That's conventional. What we've been doing the last 70 is a great industrial chemical experiment. And folks, in many, many ways, the wheels are coming off of that bus. And we're starting to see really the detrimental effects of that system, which in the beginning was held up to us with so much promise and so much enthusiasm. But now we have resistant weeds to chemicals. We have all kinds of chemical contamination of our soils, of our water. I mean, we have a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. This is the size of New Jersey. You know, how big does it have to get before we say it's enough? Children are not encouraged or even someplace allowed to drink the water in Iowa because of the nitrates. We have glyphosate in our rain. And I'm thinking, how polluted do we have to get in this earth to say it's enough? So anyway, that to me is not conventional. That is an organic or a chemical experiment that I'm looking forward to the end of. So the way that conventional in the classic sense of the word and the way that nature works is that all these animals and birds and insects and plants and microbiology are giving and taking from the system in a way that goes together into a perfect cycle that works in the long term. Sometimes you have, you know, episodes that stress it a lot along the way, but it's very resilient because of its diversity. And the more we mimic nature in our organic regenerative farm systems, the more resilient and stable they will be. So that's one big thing that I have learned. Also is the focus on soil regeneration. And I'll show you in a minute how we try to mimic nature with that. Nature is full of all kinds of plants, as I told you, or mentioned before, and you well know. Some of them are legumes, which fix nitrogen and add nitrogen, and others take nitrogen. So it's just a big cycle. So we believe that healthy soil plus nutritious seeds, not some this GMO stuff and some of these other things, equal healthy plants, which then produce healthy people. And we focus now, contrary to the way I was taught, we focus on feeding the soil. And we understand that the soil, a healthy soil, can take care of and produce healthy plants. So this is what our effort to mimic nature looks like in north central Montana. It's an area we only get 12 to 14 inches of rain. We actually have to water our lawns, you see, and they're not very big. But the red lines up there are our soil building crops. We plant those every other year. Most of the farms in our area only grow one crop to harvest every 2 years. And the second year is the fallow year. And nowadays it's chem fallow. So people are spraying glyphosate 3 or 4 times a year during that fallow season to kill the weeds and let the water build up. And that's how they have enough water then to grow a good crop the next year. So those years in red, the peas, the sweet clover, the lentils, the alfalfa, are all plants then that are not harvested for seed or for hay, but work back in the soil. We don't plow. We don't use the plow at all. We try to leave as much material on top of the ground as possible, using shallow cultivation and as little as possible, just to kill the plants and then to kill weeds later on. Some of those crops produce such an abundance of biomass, it mulches the soil, and we don't even have to worry about weeds for the rest of that summer. The black years are our cash crops. So we rotate between winter wheat, spring wheat, barley, Ohio Lake safflower, which is our oil crop, and then alfalfa hay. And we also do some buckwheat, sometimes some peas. So we mix things up a little. I like to focus on crops that have high, not only high nutrition, but a medicinal value. So the purple barley has anthocyanins, and the naked barley has beta-glucans that reduce cholesterol. The Keynote Coruscant, I'll tell you about in a second, has properties which lower inflammation. And the winter wheat we're looking at is usually spelt or some other heirloom wheat rather than some of our modern varieties.